The first appraisal of Eleanor's worth that autumn was meant to be spoken low, behind a half-shut door, but the door was not shut quite enough, and every figure reached her regardless. She did not set down the basket of mended linen balanced against her hip. She did not press her ear nearer the gap to hear better. She did not let the small, cold thing moving through her chest climb high enough to reach her face. Ashcombe Hall held itself that October the way old houses do when they have outlived the affection of the people who built them, all correct stone and indifferent windows. In the third year of a marriage the county still called new, because no one had yet found a kinder word for it. This was the corridor kept for housemaids and linen baskets, not for a duchess, though it was the one Eleanor knew best, because it let her cross from the nursery wing to the kitchens without meeting anyone who might wonder aloud why she still counted candle stubs herself. The word on the other side of the door was keep. Not wife. Not duchess. Keep. As though she were a hearth somebody had to feed, or a horse somebody had to stable, an expense with a pulse. Lady Fenwick's voice, dry as a ledger page turning, was explaining to Mr. Crane the solicitor that it might do the Duchess a great deal of good to hear the full sum of her keep read aloud at the quarter-day accounting, since she seemed to labor under the delusion that thrift in the sewing-room excused extravagance everywhere else, and Mr. Crane, who owed his position to never disagreeing with a Fenwick, murmured that he would prepare the figure specially. Eleanor did not need to see the smile to know it was there. Cruelty in that house always wore the face of housekeeping. That very morning, before the basket, before the door, she had caught an error in the Home Farm's rent book that would have cost the estate £11 by Lady Day, had corrected it in pencil so faint no one would ever trace the hand, and had said nothing to anyone, because saying something had a way of becoming, in that house, further proof that she meddled where a duchess ought not. No one saw. That, too, was familiar. In her sewing room upstairs sat the one object she had brought to Ashcombe that no one else wanted, a plain elm workbox with a cracked brass clasp, its corners gone pale with handling, holding needles, thread gone soft with age, and a scrap of linen worked in her mother's careful, unfashionable stitching. It looked, beside the ivory and rosewood boxes the other ladies kept, like something salvaged from a fire. Lady Cassandra Marlowe had once lifted its lid with 2 fingers, as one might lift the lid from something faintly spoiled, and said what a sweet, sturdy little thing it was, so wonderfully suited to actual use, and the room had understood her meaning perfectly, while Eleanor could rebut nothing at all. The words had sounded like praise. The pressure beneath them had not been. Eleanor's mother had died when Eleanor was 14, of a fever that took less than a week to do its work, and the last whole afternoon of her had been spent exactly as most of her afternoons had been spent, bent over that same workbox by a window with poor light, guiding her daughter's needle through a hem that would not lie flat. The smell of beeswax and cold tea, the particular scrape of her mother's chair drawn close, the whisper, delivered without looking up, as if it cost nothing to say and everything to mean, the stitch nobody sees, Eleanor, is the one that holds the coat together. She had turned that sentence over so many times in 9 years that its edges had gone smooth as a coin carried in a pocket. But she had never yet found the moment to spend it. No one has ever assembled a household audit out of love. An audit only ever measures what a family has already decided it resents. She had married Julian Ashcombe, 6th Duke of Ashcombe, in a ceremony attended by exactly the number of guests required to make the thing legal, and none of the number required to make it feel celebrated, because her father, Baron Edmund Voss, had owed the old duke a debt so old it had grown teeth of its own, and the marriage had been the only coin left in the Voss strongbox large enough to satisfy it. Julian had been 29 then, already known through 3 counties as a man whose voice never rose because it had never needed to, whose silences were studied the way other men's rages were studied, and whose father had raised him on the principle that a duke who let his face show his feelings had already lost whatever argument was underway. He had not courted Eleanor so much as arrived at her, correct and unreadable, on a February morning with a ring in his pocket and nothing in his eyes she could translate. 3 years had not changed that. What had changed, slowly, invisibly, was Eleanor. Society forgives almost any fault in a woman except being underestimated correctly, and Eleanor had spent 3 years being underestimated with devastating accuracy. She managed the tenant accounts that Mr. Crane took credit for balancing. She had taught the youngest scullery maid, a girl named Peg with a stammer and a quick mind, to read well enough to manage a market list, and no one above the kitchen stairs knew the lessons had ever occurred. She had, without asking permission from anyone, replanted the east kitchen garden after 2 ruinous summers, using seed saved from her mother's own garden at Voss Manor, so that by the second autumn Ashcomb's kitchens were feeding 40 people on a garden that had fed 12. Julian had eaten the results of that garden at every meal for a year, without once connecting the better soup to his wife's hands in the dirt. This was not cruelty in him, precisely, so much as a blindness cultivated the way some men cultivate a beard, out of habit and the comfort of not looking closely at anything that might ask something of him. Lady Fenwick, his father's younger sister, had run Ashcomb's household since the old Duchess's death and regarded Eleanor's arrival the way a woman regards a new clock that keeps slightly different time than the one she has trusted for 20 years, as an inconvenience requiring correction rather than an improvement requiring welcome. Lady Cassandra Marlowe, meanwhile, had been the county's settled expectation for Julian's hand for the better part of 5 years before the debt and the wedding intervened, and she had never quite located a way to be angry about it that did not sound, to a listening room, like wit. She still came to Ashcombe often, on the strength of old friendship with Lady Fenwick and a standing invitation from the Dowager Duchess that no one had ever formally rescinded, and she brought with her a talent for turning a barb into a compliment before it could be recognized as a wound, so that by the time the room understood what had been said, Cassandra was already laughing at something else. Not everyone laughed with equal warmth. Enough did. That was always enough. Against this arithmetic, Eleanor had exactly 2 allies in the house, and she treasured both without ever quite trusting that either would be permitted to remain. Lady Prudence, Julian's younger sister, 19 and unmarried and possessed of a tongue her brother's household, had not yet succeeded in teaching restraint, had decided within a fortnight of the wedding that she liked her new sister enormously and did not care who knew it. It was Prudence who found Eleanor in the still room one wet afternoon in September, sorting dried lavender with red-rimmed eyes she refused to explain, and said only, without preamble, that her brother was a fool who mistook silence for strength, and that any woman who could love him despite the evidence deserved a medal rather than a ledger entry. And then left before Eleanor could either agree or defend him, which was, Eleanor suspected, precisely the point. The Dowager Duchess Augusta, Julian's grandmother, 81 years old and feared by every solicitor in the county, had taken one look at Eleanor across the wedding breakfast 3 years before and declared, to no one in particular, but loudly enough for several people to hear, that the girl had better bones than the whole of the Marlowe family put together, by which she meant something closer to character than to skeleton, and had never once required Eleanor to prove it since. She believed Eleanor before Eleanor had finished a sentence, a habit so rare in that house that Eleanor had at first mistaken it for a kind of joke. It was not admiration, not yet precisely, that the old woman felt for her, but something closer to recognition, the particular fondness the very old sometimes have for the young who have already learned what the very old spent decades learning the hard way. Baron Edmund Voss visited Ashcombe twice a year, at Christmas and at midsummer, and each visit followed the same shape with the reliability of a tide. He would arrive travel-worn and apologetic, praise his daughter extravagantly at dinner in front of the family, call her his clever girl, his good girl, so wonderfully capable with figures, and then, within a day of arriving, find a private moment to ask whether she might see her way to a small advance against her allowance, only until his own affairs settled, only this once. It was never only once. Eleanor gave what she had each time, because refusing felt, even now, like refusing her mother's memory rather than her father's request, and because the alternative, an open accounting between them of exactly how many times only once had already occurred, was a conversation she had not yet found the courage to begin. The words he used sounded like love. The weight behind them was closer to withdrawal. She told herself, each visit, that she would speak plainly to him before he left, that this time she would say the true sentence rather than the comfortable one, and each visit the carriage pulled away down the long drive with the true sentence still unspoken inside her, folded small, kept for later the way she kept everything else. Julian noticed none of this directly, because Julian noticed almost nothing directly that autumn, his attention when it moved through a room, moved like a surveyor's, cataloging structural soundness and leaving the people inside the structure largely to their own devices. But there were, even that early, small betrayals of a different kind of attention beginning to stir beneath the surveying one. He had, in August, without explanation, quietly instructed Mr. Crane that the Duchess's correspondence with the tenant families was to be routed through her directly rather than summarized for her by the steward, a change so small that only Eleanor registered it. And she had registered it the way one registers the first mild day after a long winter, with suspicion before relief. He had, in September, at a dinner where Lady Fenwick observed that the Duchess seemed unusually fond of the kitchen garden for a woman of her rank, said only, without looking up from his plate, that a garden which fed 40 people on the yield that had once fed 12 struck him as an economy rather than an eccentricity. And the table had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when a correction has been delivered too precisely to argue with. Eleanor had felt that correction land somewhere beneath her ribs and had told herself firmly that it signified nothing, that a duke defending an economy was not the same as a husband defending a wife, and had gone on believing that distinction for exactly as long as it took the quarter-day accounting to arrive. The quarter-day accounting at Ashcombe was old ritual dressed as modern practice, a formal reading of the estate's books before assembled family, senior tenants, and whichever guests happened to be visiting at the season's turn, held after the last course and before the tea things. In the great dining hall, where the family portraits watched from walls too high to be warmed by any fire. It existed, in theory, to demonstrate to the tenantry that the Duke's stewardship was open and honest. It existed, in practice, as theater, and every family in the county understood the difference. That November evening the hall had been dressed for it with a chill formality that made Eleanor think of a church rather than a home, white cloth, plain silver rather than the ceremonial gold kept for weddings and christenings. Tall candles burning in a warm, flattering light that lied about the temperature of the room the way warm light always did. Rain moved against the tall windows in long, unhurried strokes, as though the weather itself had settled in to listen. Lady Fenwick had seated herself at Julian's right hand rather than at the foot of the table, a small territorial correction she made at every such dinner, and Cassandra Marlowe sat near enough to catch the candlelight along one bare shoulder, in silk the deep unapologetic blue of a color Eleanor's mother would have called wasteful. Eleanor wore gray, mended at one cuff so finely that only she knew the mend was there. A plainness that had once been a private economy and had somehow, without her noticing the shift, become something closer to a uniform. The room filled slowly the way water fills a basin, guests and senior tenants finding their places, conversation thinning as it always thinned when Mr. Crane rose with his ledgers, the candles throwing long, attentive shadows up the walls until even the painted Ashcombe ancestors seemed to lean forward to hear. Julian took the ledger from Crane's hands himself that night, which was not the custom, and Eleanor felt the first small lift of something like hope, foolish and immediate. That he meant to read it as a gift to the tenants rather than a performance for the family, that this might be, at last, the evening he chose to stand beside her instead of merely near her. He read the harvest figures first, and the timber accounts, and the small triumphant sum saved by the reseeded kitchen garden, which he noted, without glancing her way, had been the Duchess's initiative, and for one warm, foolish moment, the whole room's attention turned to her with something almost like approval, and she let herself feel it, just barely, the way one lets oneself feel the first sun of a cold spring. Then he turned a page, and his voice, without any change of pitch or temperature, without any awareness at all of the door closing behind his own words, began to read the household's personal expenditures, and there, itemized beneath the coal and the candles and the stable accounts, was a line Lady Fenwick had ensured Mr. Crane included exactly as she had promised the solicitor she would, the cost of her Grace's keep, itemized to the shilling, gowns and medicines, and a small standing allowance to Baron Voss, set down in a column beside the year's modest income from her own dowry lands, the two figures placed close enough together that anyone with eyes could see which one was larger and by how much. Julian read it the way he read everything, in the same level, unhurried voice, because to him it was one line among 40, and he had not yet learned, in that instant, to hear what the room around him was hearing. He did not pause. He did not understand, not yet, that a sum can be an insult even when every figure in it is true. The room, however, understood perfectly and did what rooms do. It went very still, in the specific way that silence has when it is not empty, but full, held breath rather than absent sound. A fork set down half-raised, Cassandra's smile arriving a fraction too quickly to be anything but prepared. Keep was only the respectable coat that Cost had chosen to wear that evening, and everyone at that table recognized the coat immediately, whatever they called it aloud. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, and did not flush, and did not reach for her wine, and did not let her breathing change, because she had spent 3 years teaching her body not to answer insult with evidence, and her body, obedient, did not answer now. Somewhere beneath the stillness, a single fragile catalogue assembled itself behind her eyes, and stayed there. Unspoken, she could have said that the garden alone had saved more than the whole column cost. She could have said that her father's allowance had begun as a wedding condition of the Ashcombe solicitors, and not her own extravagance. She could have said that a woman priced like livestock in her own dining hall might at least be permitted to know the sum before it was read to 40 witnesses. She said none of it. She only reached up, with a steadiness that cost her more than anyone in that room would ever know, and drew the plain gold band from her finger and set it without a word. Directly atop the column of figures Julian had just finished reading, the small, definite click of metal against paper, the only sound in a hall that had gone otherwise silent as a held breath. It was not a gesture that explained itself, and that was precisely its power. It could be read as surrender, as protest, as an offer to settle the account in full and be done. And Eleanor let it be read however the room chose to read it, because she had said, in the only language left available to her, everything that could not safely be said aloud. She did not look at him after. That was the turn, small and entire, not "I have been wronged," which she had known for 3 years, but "I will not be tallied," which she had never, until that instant, let herself decide. Julian's hand, holding the ledger, went very still. It was the only sign anyone at that table could later swear to, and only Eleanor was close enough to see it, and she did not yet know what to make of a stillness that might have been shame or might have been merely surprise, the counterpart's interior forever a country she was not permitted to enter. No thunder answered the moment, and no curtain fell across the tall, dark windows, and the rain outside kept its own unhurried rhythm exactly as it had before, indifferent to the precise second a woman's worth had been priced like mutton in her own dining hall. Lady Fenwick recovered first, murmuring something about the lateness of the hour and the readiness of the tea things, and the room, grateful for permission, resumed its low conversational hum within the space of half a minute, forks lifted again. Cassandra's laugh arriving on cue at some remark from the gentleman beside her, the world proving once again its talent for closing over a wound as smoothly as water closes over a dropped stone. No one asked Eleanor if she required anything, no one but Prudence, 3 seats down, whose face had gone white and furious, and who half rose from her chair before the Dowager Duchess's hand closed like a vice around her wrist and held her still. Because Augusta understood, faster than anyone else at that table, that the worst thing that could happen to Eleanor in that moment was rescue performed loudly enough to require her gratitude. The tea things arrived. The candles burned on in their warm, flattering, dishonest light. Eleanor rose when the company rose and inclined her head to the departing tenants with exactly the courtesy the evening required, and did not retrieve the ring from where it lay atop the ledger, because to reach for it now would have been to admit that setting it down had cost her something, and she had already given that room enough. It was Julian, alone in the emptied hall some 20 minutes later, who found the ring still resting where she had left it, small and plain and entirely without ornament, catching the last low candlelight the way nothing else at that overdressed table had caught it all evening. And it was Julian who stood over it for a long moment, with an expression no one was present to read, and who finally closed his hand around it and did not, for reasons he did not examine even to himself, send it up to her rooms that night. The following morning arrived beneath a sky the rain had scrubbed clean, and Ashcombe went on exactly as Ashcombe always went on. Breakfast laid, correspondence sorted, the kitchen garden's last hardy vegetables brought in ahead of frost, as though nothing at all had happened in the dining hall the previous evening, which was, Eleanor reflected, watching Peg carry in the marrow she herself had planted, the particular cruelty of ordinary mornings, that they insisted on arriving regardless. She wore gloves that day, an old habit revived, so that the bare finger where the ring should have been would not announce itself to a household already fluent in reading her. Lady Fenwick said nothing of the previous evening at all, which was itself a kind of verdict, cruelty complete enough to require no further comment. Cassandra, encountering Eleanor in the long gallery before noon, offered only that she hoped the Duchess had slept well. There had been so much rain, and Eleanor answered that she had slept as well as the house allowed, a reply mild enough to pass for pleasantry and precise enough, to anyone listening closely, to indict the house rather than the weather. And Cassandra's smile flickered for exactly as long as it took her to decide not to notice. It was not a question, Cassandra's inquiry after her sleep. None of Cassandra's questions ever were. Julian did not appear at breakfast that morning, nor at the midday meal, a fact the household absorbed without comment, because dukes were permitted absences that duchesses were not. Eleanor told herself she did not mark it, and told herself this several more times than the claims strictly required to be believed. She spent the afternoon in the still room with Prudence, who did not raise the subject of the ledger directly, but who sat close, and passed her the good scissors without being asked, and once, apropos of nothing, remarked that her brother had always possessed an infuriating gift for hearing figures and missing meaning entirely, a fault their father had trained into him the way one trains a hunting dog, thoroughly and with the best intentions, and no regard whatsoever for what the dog might have preferred to become. Eleanor did not answer that either, though something in her chest loosened very slightly at hearing it said aloud by someone who loved him. That evening, crossing the long gallery on her way to her rooms, Eleanor found Julian standing before the portrait of his own mother, the third Duchess, a woman who had died before Eleanor ever met him, and about whom the household spoke rarely and carefully, as one speaks around old grief that has never been permitted to heal correctly. He did not turn at her step, though she knew, from the particular set of his shoulders, that he had heard it. Between his fingers, when she came near enough to see, was the ring. He did not offer it back to her directly. He said only, in the low, even voice that had never once, in 3 years, needed to rise, that he had not understood until he sat alone in that hall with the ledger in his hands, precisely what he had permitted to be read into his house, and that he did not ask her to consider the matter closed, because he did not yet believe it was closed himself. It was not an apology shaped the way apologies are usually shaped, with an accounting of fault and a request for pardon, and Eleanor, who had spent 3 years learning to distrust anything that resembled warmth arriving too quickly, found she did not entirely trust it either. She said only that the sum had at least been accurate, which was more than most things read aloud in that hall could claim, and watched something move behind his eyes that might have been the beginning of a smile, and might have been merely surprised that she had answered him at all, rather than accepting whatever he offered in silence, as she had accepted everything else for 3 years. He held the ring out then, on his open palm rather than pressed into her hand, a distinction she noted and did not yet know what to do with, and said that it belonged to her, whatever else in that house did or did not, and that he would not have it said again by anyone in his hearing that she had not earned every right to wear it. She took it back and did not put it on again that night, keeping it instead closed in her own fist the whole walk back to her rooms, because some decisions, she was learning, needed to be made alone before they could be worn in public. Winter arrived at Ashcombe in the ordinary way, frost first on the kitchen garden Eleanor had built, and then on the long drive, and finally on the tall windows of the dining hall itself, and with it arrived a slow, almost imperceptible alteration in the shape of Julian's attention, the kind of change so gradual that Eleanor spent the first fortnight of December persuading herself she had invented it. He began appearing where she was without any stated reason for being there, in the estate office when she brought the tenant correspondence Crane still resented routing to her directly, in the still-room doorway when Prudence had her laughing over some absurdity of Cassandra's latest visit, in the kitchen garden itself one gray morning, standing at the edge of the frost-killed beds with his hands behind his back, watching her direct peg in the last of the autumn digging with an attention that had nothing surveying left in it at all. He asked her once, with the particular dry economy that passed in him for warmth, whether the garden's next season's yield might be persuaded to feed 50 rather than 40. And when she answered that it might, given a longer south wall and slightly less interference from Mr. Crane, he had said only that the wall could be arranged, and Crane's interference he would attend to personally, and something in the flat certainty of that sentence had made her want, absurdly, to laugh. Lady Fenwick noticed the change before Eleanor allowed herself to trust it, and did not care for it, and began, with the patient persistence of a woman who had run that household for 2 decades and did not intend to be instructed in it by a baron's daughter, to find small occasions to remind the family of exactly what Eleanor had cost them. A comment here about the expense of replacing the east wing's rotted window frames. A comment there about how fortunate it was that some households could absorb a poor dowry so gracefully. Cassandra, for her part, had begun watching Julian watch Eleanor with an attention of her own, cool and assessing, the particular vigilance of a woman recalculating a sum she had believed long settled. And Eleanor, who had learned to read rooms the way sailors learn to read weather, understood without being told that the notice she had waited 3 years for had arrived at the exact moment it was most dangerous to receive. Because attention in that house had never once been given to her without a bill attached to someone else's resentment. Not admiration yet, she told herself, walking the long gallery alone one December evening, with the frost silvering the tall windows, and her mother's aphorism moving through her the way it always moved through her, in moments she could not otherwise name. Not admiration. Not yet. Only the first thin thread of something that might, given enough winters, be permitted to grow into it. And she folded that thought small, the way she folded everything that mattered too much to risk aloud, and kept it, for now, exactly where she kept the ring, close against her, and entirely her own. Christmas at Ashcombe arrived wrapped in greenery and a formality that had, for the first time in 3 years, a current of something warmer running beneath its correctness, and Eleanor spent the season learning the particular vertigo of being watched by a man who had spent 3 years appearing not to watch her at all. Julian found reasons, now, to walk the long gallery at the hour she crossed it, to linger in the estate office past the point his signature was required, to ask, with the dry economy that in him passed for tenderness, whether the new south wall for the kitchen garden had settled well against the frost, and each small question landed on her with a weight entirely out of proportion to its size, because she had spent so long parsing his silences for meaning that his plain speech now felt like a kind of undressing. She did not trust it easily. Trust, in that house, had always come with a bill attached to someone else's resentment, and she had learned to check the accounting before accepting the gift. Lady Fenwick, sensing the shift the way a hound senses weather, sharpened her small cruelties rather than softening them, remarking at the Christmas Eve supper, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to, that it was touching how devoted His Grace had become to matters of the kitchen garden, though one supposed a man must find some occupation for his attention when his wife provided so little society of her own kind. The words sounded like concern for Julian's happiness. The intent beneath them was to remind the table, gently and repeatedly, that Eleanor had been imported rather than chosen. Eleanor answered only that she was glad the garden gave His Grace some pleasure, since so little else at Ashcombe seemed designed to, and watched Fenwick's mouth tighten at an answer too polite to punish and too precise to misunderstand. It was Cassandra, 3 nights later at the New Year gathering, who delivered the barb with the greatest craft, admiring aloud how remarkably the Duchess had managed, over 3 years, to make herself indispensable to the household's smaller economies, the linens, the garden, the tenant correspondence. One might almost mistake her for the housekeeper. How useful, how very useful indeed. The room's laughter came readily enough, not universal, but enough, because Cassandra had a genius for phrasing insult as flattery that even those who pitied Eleanor could not quite resist enjoying. Eleanor set down her cup with a steadiness that cost her everything she had left that evening, and answered that she supposed a house ran more smoothly when someone troubled to notice what needed doing, and that she had always found it a curious economy in great houses. How much credit accrued to those who noticed nothing at all? It was not an insult by any measure a magistrate could recognize. Cassandra's smile flickered exactly once, the fraction of a second in which the room's understanding caught up with the sentence, and Julian, at the head of the table, did not smile at all. But something in the stillness of his face suggested he had heard the exchange in full and filed it somewhere he intended to keep. A gentleman does not applaud his wife's wit at his own table without inviting further war, and Julian, whatever else he had not yet learned to say aloud, had learned that lesson early. He found her afterward in the corridor outside the music room, where she had retreated to recover the composure the supper had cost her, and said only, low enough that it would not carry, that she fought better with a teacup in her hand than most men fought with a sword, and that he had begun to feel almost sorry for anyone at his table who mistook her stillness for surrender. It was the nearest thing to open admiration he had offered her in 3 years, and she found she did not know what to do with it except deflect it, telling him that a woman who had been tallied like livestock in her own dining hall developed certain skills out of necessity rather than talent, and watching, with a small, unwilling satisfaction, the flinch that crossed his face at the reminder, because she had not yet decided to let him forget it entirely. Some things, once said in a full hall, could not simply be forgiven by candlelight in an empty corridor. He did not argue the point. He only said that he understood it would take longer than a season to earn back what one evening had cost, and that he intended to spend whatever time it required, and left her standing there with that sentence settled somewhere in her chest like a coal banked for later. Neither admiration, yet nor mere recognition, but something warmer than either, that she folded small, as she folded everything, and kept. The letter arrived on the second Tuesday of January, in the ordinary morning post, sealed in plain wax, with no signature and no return direction, addressed to His Grace, the Duke of Ashcombe, in a hand disguised just enough to defeat easy recognition, and not quite enough to defeat close comparison. And it was Mr. Crane who brought it to Julian in the estate office, with the particular gray face of a man who has already read something he cannot unknow. The letter alleged, in careful legal language clearly drafted by someone with more than a passing acquaintance with conveyancing, that the deed by which Baron Edmund Voss had transferred the parcel known as Hollow Fen to the Ashcombe estate in settlement of his debt to the 5th Duke had never been properly executed, that the signature attributed to the old Duke's steward upon it was not his hand at all, and that the entire transaction, upon which both the debt's satisfaction and the marriage settlement built upon it depended, was therefore void from its inception. If the claim held, the letter continued, with the cold precision of a blade laid flat against skin, then the marriage contract itself rested upon a fraud. The Baron stood exposed to prosecution for that fraud. And the Duchess's very position at Ashcombe, her settlement, her standing, her right to the name she carried, became a question a court might be asked to answer, rather than a fact any longer secure from asking. Julian read it twice before he set it down, and Crane, watching him, said quietly that such a claim, however unsigned and however base its origin, could not simply be ignored, because an anonymous accusation of this particular shape, once whispered in the right ears at the county assizes, had a way of becoming an inquiry whether or not any magistrate believed it, and an inquiry, once opened, took its own time regardless of the truth waiting at the bottom of it. This was no longer an insult that could be absorbed by silence at a dinner table. This was a document with the power to unmake, by the slow grinding machinery of the law rather than the swift cruelty of gossip, everything Eleanor had spent 3 years building a place inside. Julian did not send for her immediately. He sat alone with the letter for the better part of an hour, And it was Prudence passing the estate office and finding the door unaccountably shut against a brother who never shut doors against his own sister, who first sensed that something had shifted in the house's weather. And it was Prudence who told Eleanor, gently and without preamble, that something had arrived that morning that had put a look on Julian's face she had not seen since their father's funeral. Eleanor heard the substance of the letter from Julian's own mouth that evening in the estate office by a fire that had burned low enough to throw more shadow than warmth across the room, and she listened to the whole of it with the particular stillness she had spent 3 years perfecting, hands folded, breath even, giving the accusation nothing of the reaction it had clearly been engineered to produce. When he finished, she asked, in a voice steadier than she felt entitled to, whether he believed it. He said, after a silence long enough that she counted 4 full breaths inside it, that he did not know what he believed yet, only that a claim of this weight required proof before it could be dismissed, and that he intended to see it properly examined rather than buried, for her sake as much as the estate's. It was, she understood even then, the most honest answer he could have given her, and also, in its own way, the least comforting. Because a man who loved without condition does not require proof to disbelieve an accusation against the person he loves, and Julian, whatever he had begun to feel, had not yet learned to love without first consulting the ledger. Not admiration yet, not even trust, quite, only the beginning of a willingness to look properly before he judged. Which was, she told herself, walking back to her rooms that night with her arms wrapped tight against a cold that had nothing to do with the season, more than most men in his position would have offered a wife they had married for a debt rather than a wish. Lady Fenwick learned of the letter within 2 days, because Lady Fenwick learned everything within 2 days, and she did not trouble to disguise her opinion of what ought to follow from it. A prudent household, she observed at breakfast, in the mild, reasonable tone she reserved for her cruelest suggestions, might consider it wise for the Duchess to remove to her father's house while the matter was examined, for the sake of appearances, if nothing else, since a scandal of this shape reflected poorly on everyone housed beneath the same roof as its center. The suggestion sounded like concern for the family's dignity. Its true purpose was to remove Eleanor from the house before Julian's newly wavering attention could harden into loyalty. Julian said only, without raising his voice, that the Duchess would remain exactly where she was, and that any appearance requiring her absence was an appearance not worth preserving. And Fenwick's mouth thinned into the particular line it took when she had been overruled and intended to remember it. Cassandra, calling 3 days later on the pretext of concern for dear Eleanor's nerves during such a trying time, was solicitous in a manner so carefully calibrated that Eleanor found herself watching the performance with something closer to admiration than resentment, the way one admires a skilled forger without wishing to be forged. "Is everything quite all right?" Cassandra asked, taking Eleanor's hand in both of hers. "One hears such stories, and it must be dreadful, not knowing what the assizes will decide," and Eleanor answered that she found she slept remarkably well, all things considered, since she had done nothing requiring a guilty conscience, and watched something flicker behind Cassandra's carefully arranged sympathy that might, in a less composed observer, have been mistaken for alarm. It was not a question, Cassandra's inquiry after her nerves. It rarely was. Baron Voss arrived unannounced 11 days after the letter, travel-stained and gray, with a fear Eleanor had never once seen on him in her whole life, not even at her mother's funeral, and the performance of extravagant paternal affection he usually offered at Christmas and midsummer had been entirely stripped away, leaving underneath it a smaller, older man who gripped her hands in the estate office and swore, with a desperation too raw to be theater, that whatever else he had done in his life, he had never forged a single line of that deed, that Holofen had passed to old Ashcombe honestly, badly needed, and bitterly given, but honestly given, and that he would not have his daughter's marriage and his own neck both forfeited for a crime. Committed, if it had been committed at all, by some clerk he had never met. Eleanor believed him, not because he had earned her trust over the years, for he had spent that trust steadily and without much care for its balance, but because fear of this particular shape, she had learned, was very hard to counterfeit, and because a man clever enough to forge a deed successfully rarely panicked this completely when the forgery was merely alleged rather than discovered. It was the Dowager Duchess Augusta who took charge of the investigation in the end, because Augusta had outlived 3 solicitors and buried 2 husbands, and had developed, across 81 years, an instinct for locating the single loose thread in any garment of lies, however finely woven. She summoned Eleanor to her private sitting room the week after the Baron's visit, poured her a glass of the sherry she claimed improved thinking, and said, without any preamble at all, that she did not believe a word of the letter, that anonymous accusations arriving precisely when a household's happiness had begun to inconvenience someone were, in her considerable experience, almost never honest, and that the 2 of them were going to find the lie in it before the quarter. Sessions found anything else. They began with the deed itself, retrieved from the estate's strongbox and laid flat across Augusta's writing table beside the anonymous letter. The 2 documents compared line by line under a single steady lamp while the rest of the house slept. It was Eleanor who noticed it first, because Eleanor had spent 3 years reading land papers no one else in that house troubled to read, and because she remembered, from her own father's rambling stories of the county's old families, a name that had no business appearing where it appeared. The anonymous letter, in laying out its accusation, cited as proof of forgery a boundary survey supposedly commissioned to verify Holofen's acreage at the time of the original conveyance, a survey it attributed to one Josiah Pratt, land surveyor, whose findings, the letter claimed, contradicted the deed's stated measurements and thereby exposed the whole transaction as fraudulent from its foundation. Eleanor sat very still over the page for a long moment, and then said, in a voice she kept carefully level though something like triumph was already rising beneath it, that Josiah Pratt had not been the county's surveyor at the date the letter claimed, that he had not taken up the post at all until a full 2 years after that date, having spent those years apprenticed in Norwich. A fact she knew only because her own father had complained bitterly, more than once, about having to wait for Pratt's predecessor's slow and drunken surveys the very year the Holofen conveyance was made. There it is, Augusta said, setting down her glass with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has just watched a house of cards discover its own foundation. There it is, exactly. A forger clever enough to invent a scandal and careless enough to invent a witness who did not yet hold the office the letter claims for him. A lie only needs one loose thread to be found unraveling entirely, however many honest threads have been woven in around it to disguise the theft. They confirmed it within the week, Augusta dispatching her own solicitor, a dry, precise man named Hale, who owed her more favors than he could ever hope to repay, to the parish records at Norwich, which returned exactly the answer Eleanor had predicted. Pratt's apprenticeship papers, dated a full 2 years past the survey the anonymous letter swore he had conducted, an impossibility so plain that even Mr. Crane, presented with it in Julian's office, went the color of old paper and admitted that he could not account for how such an error had escaped his own earlier reading of the accusation, though Augusta suggested, with a dryness that made Crane flinch, that perhaps he had simply been too eager to believe ill of a duchess he had never much wanted in the family to trouble himself with checking her. Facts. Julian read the confirmed anomaly in silence, the same silence he had given the original letter. But this time, Eleanor watched something ease in his shoulders that had been held tight for 3 weeks, and when he finally spoke it, was to say, quietly, that he owed her an apology he did not yet know how to phrase properly, for having required proof at all before disbelieving an accusation against a woman who had given him 3 years of evidence deserving better than a ledger's worth of doubt. It was not, Eleanor thought, quite everything she might once have wanted to hear, but it was, from a man raised to distrust his own face, very nearly everything he had. The magistrate at the quarter sessions, presented with Hale's findings and the impossible date, dismissed the accusation within a single sitting, though the anonymous author remained, deliberately, unnamed in any official record, the letter itself unsigned and untraceable to any hand a court could compel to answer for it. And it was this unresolved edge, this absence of a face to blame, that kept the whole household uneasy even as the immediate danger lifted, because a lie exposed is not the same as a liar caught, and someone in the county or nearer had wanted badly enough to see Eleanor's marriage undone that they had commissioned a forgery clever enough to nearly succeed. Some miles away, in a rented parlor above a milliner's shop in the county town, Cassandra Marlowe read the notice of the magistrate's dismissal in a 2-day-old newspaper with a stillness of her own, folded the page precisely along its existing crease, and set it into the fire without comment to the woman who shared her rooms that season, watching it curl and blacken with an attention that suggested this particular failure had cost her something she did not intend to discuss aloud. Eleanor knew nothing of that parlor, nor of that fire, and would not learn of either for some time yet, but she felt, in the weeks that followed the dismissal, the particular unease of a woman who has survived one blow only to sense, somewhere just beyond her sight, the gathering of another. Julian felt it too, though he said little of it directly, and the household settled into a wary, watchful calm through the last raw weeks of January, the frost deepening, the days short and gray, the fires kept high against a cold that seemed, that season, to reach further into the stone than usual. It was the last week of the month, with a storm building all afternoon over the low western hills, the sky gone the color of an old bruise and the wind picking at the tall windows with a persistence that made even the dogs restless, that Julian sent word he wished to speak with her that evening, alone, once the household had retired, in the library rather than the estate office. A distinction Eleanor noted and turned over for the better part of an hour without arriving at any comfortable conclusion. She dressed with more care than the hour strictly required and told herself it meant nothing and did not entirely believe herself even as she told it. The storm broke properly just past 9, rain driving hard enough against the glass to blur the garden into a single gray smear, thunder rolling somewhere low over the hills like a held threat finally released, and it was into that sound, that isolation, the rest of Ashcombe already dark and settled behind closed doors, that Eleanor walked down the long gallery toward the library with her mother's aphorism moving through her unbidden. The stitch nobody sees is the one that holds the coat together, as though some part of her already understood that whatever waited beyond that door would ask her to hold something together that had been coming apart, quietly, for 3 long years. The library door was already open when she reached it, firelight spilling into the gallery in a long gold bar across the dark floor, and Julian stood not at his desk, where she had half expected to find him behind the safety of papers, but near the cold hearth end of the room, as though he had positioned himself deliberately at the greatest possible distance from anything that might let him hide. Behind duty. Thunder rolled again outside, nearer now, and rain came against the tall windows in sheets that made the glass shudder faintly in its old frames, sealing the room off from the rest of the house as completely as any locked door could have done. He did not speak when she entered. He only looked at her the way he had looked at the ring resting atop the ledger 3 months before, as though something in the room had finally stopped being an object he was permitted to survey from a comfortable distance. She stood just inside the doorway and made no move toward him, because she had spent 3 years learning that the safest position in any room was the one nearest the exit. And habits built over 3 years do not dissolve simply because a storm has made a house feel briefly like a different world. He crossed half the distance between them first, slowly, the way a man crosses ice he does not entirely trust, and stopped an arm's length short of her, close enough that she could see the fire moving in his eyes, but not so close that she could mistake proximity for claim. "I did not ask you here to discuss the letter," he said, and his voice, when it came, had already begun shedding the flat, level authority she had known for 3 years, the surveyor's register giving way to something rougher and less rehearsed. "I did not ask you here to discuss the letter," he said again, "and I did not ask you here because Fenwick expects an announcement. And I did not ask you here because a duke owes his duchess some gesture of reconciliation after a bad season, though God knows I owe you that and more besides." 3 sentences, each beginning the same way, each one a door he opened only to show her it was empty, and Eleanor recognized the shape of it even before he reached the 4th. Because her mother's aphorism had taught her long ago that the truest thing in any speech was usually the thing spoken last, after everything false had been cleared away to make room for it. "I asked you here," he said, and this time his voice dropped low enough that the storm nearly swallowed it, "because I have spent 3 months watching you carry a house that was never built to hold you, and 3 years before that failing to notice you were carrying it at all, and I find I no longer know how to stand in a room with you and pretend that watching you is the same as merely observing an asset the estate happens to possess." He said her name then, only her name, Eleanor, without title or office attached to it, the first time in 3 years she could recall him using it, entirely alone, and something in her chest answered it before her mind gave her leave to trust the answering. She did not move toward him. She made herself hold the small distance between them, because she had learned, at considerable cost, that a woman who surrendered the instant kindness was offered had already forgotten the ledger that kindness was meant to balance. "You have never once told me what you believed about that evening," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, though something beneath it trembled with the effort of keeping it so. "You stood in that hall and read my worth off a page like a man reading the weight of grain, and you did not stop, and I have spent every week since wondering whether the silence afterward was shame or only surprise, because you have never once told me which." It was not an accusation shaped to wound him, though it wounded him anyway, and she watched it land, a flinch quickly mastered. The particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow he had decided in advance he deserved. "It was shame," he said, "and it has not left me since, and I did not come to this room tonight to ask you to forgive it quickly, because I do not think it should be forgiven quickly, and I would think less of you if you offered it to me merely because a storm and an empty library made forgiveness convenient." She had not expected that answer, and it cost her something to hear it, because it was so much harder to hold a grievance against a man honest enough to agree it was deserved. The fire cracked once, low, and outside the thunder rolled further off now, retreating toward the hills the way storms do when they have said what they came to say. "I will not be kept, Julian," she said finally, the word landing between them with all the weight 3 years in one dining hall had given it. "I have been kept and costed and tallied in this house since the day I arrived, and I find I have grown tired, this last season especially, of being something a man decides whether or not he can afford." "I do not want to keep you," he said, and the correction came quickly, urgently, as though he had been waiting for the word to arrive so he could take it from her hands and turn it over into something else entirely. "I do not want to keep you the way this house has kept its accounts, set down in a column and balanced against income. I want to choose you, every morning, the way a man chooses the one thing in a house worth saving before the rest of it burns, and I have been too great a coward until tonight to say so plainly." He closed the last of the distance between them then, not swiftly, but in the same measured increment by which he had crossed the whole room, as though even now, at the center of the confession, some part of him remained careful of asking for more than she had yet offered to give. "Not because your father's debt bound me to it," he said, close enough now that she could feel the warmth off him competing with the fire. "Not because the estate requires an heir and a duchess to produce one. Not because starting the whole business over with some other woman would cost more than continuing with you. Though God knows all three of those reasons have been offered to me by people who love me and think themselves wise." 3 rejected reasons, each one true enough that a lesser man might have accepted it as sufficient, and Eleanor felt the old habit of bracing herself against disappointment loosen, fraction by fraction, as she waited to hear what he would set against them. "But because," he said, and his voice had gone entirely plain now, stripped of every trace of the Duke and left with only the man beneath it, "when this house is dark and no one is watching either of us perform for anyone, you are still the person I find myself listening for. That is the only reason I have left, and it is the only one I trust, because it is the only one that does not require an audience to be true." The library held its breath around them the way the dining hall had held its breath around the ledger, except this silence asked nothing of her, offered no verdict to endure, only waited. "Marry me again," he said, and she felt the absurdity of the request and the entire seriousness of it arrive together. Not by contract this time, not because 2 fathers decided it years before either of us had a voice in the matter, but because you wish it, freely, tonight, with nothing binding you to say yes except the truth of whether you do. It was, she understood, the nearest thing to a true proposal either of them had ever been offered, 3 years after a wedding that had never once asked either of them what they wanted, and she let the silence stretch long enough to prove to herself and to him that her answer was chosen rather than merely available. "Yes," she said finally, "because I wish it," and heard, in the small, unguarded sound he made at that answer, something she had waited 3 years to hear, and had stopped, somewhere in the last difficult season, quite believing she ever would. He did not embrace her immediately. He reached instead for her hand, the bare one, the finger that had worn the ring only intermittently since the night of the ledger, and he did not ask permission before drawing from his waistcoat pocket the plain gold band he had apparently carried there, she realized with a small shock, since the very morning after that dreadful dinner, and he slid it onto her finger himself, slowly, watching her face rather than his own hands, and then he did not let go. He kept her hand exactly where it was, folded inside both of his, long after the ring had settled home, as though releasing it now would undo everything the evening had cost them both to build. It was there with her hand held and not released, with the fire burning low, and the storm outside finally spending itself into a softer, steadier rain, that the tears came, unbidden and entirely without her permission, not the tears of a woman collapsing under a weight too long carried, but something quieter and stranger, truth simply reaching the surface after 3 years of being asked to stay submerged. She did not apologize for them. He did not ask her to stop. He only stood there holding her hand while she let herself, for the first time since her mother's death, cry in front of someone without immediately calculating what the crying would cost her afterward. 3 years later, the schoolroom Eleanor had built onto the old dairy at the edge of the kitchen garden stood finished and full, its windows glazed with proper glass rather than the cracked panes the dairy had worn for decades, and on the morning of its formal opening, the whole of the estate's tenantry gathered on the lawn before it in a crowd larger than any quarter-day accounting had ever drawn, because an audit measures what a house resents, while an opening celebrates what a house has finally decided to be proud of. Peg, grown now into a young woman of remarkable steadiness, stood at the schoolroom door with a class register in her own hand, the same hand Eleanor had once taught to shape its first uncertain letters in a kitchen no one above stairs had thought worth visiting. And it was Peg who would teach the letters now to every child on the estate whose parents could spare them a few hours from the fields, a debt of instruction passed forward exactly the way debts of cruelty had once been passed forward in that same house, except this ledger, Eleanor thought, watching the children file inside, ran only ever in credit. Lady Fenwick had not lived to see the schoolroom finished, having retired the previous winter to a smaller house in Bath after a quiet and thoroughly final disagreement with Julian regarding the household accounts she had governed for 2 decades, a disagreement that ended without any public scene at all, in her removal from every position of authority she had once used to make Eleanor's days smaller, and the county, Eleanor noticed, had absorbed the change with barely a ripple, proof enough that some tyrannies survive only as long as no one troubles to examine their foundations. Cassandra Marlowe's name, meanwhile, had not been spoken at Ashcombe in 2 years, not since Hale's continued inquiries into the forged letter had traced, through a disgraced clerk's confession and a paper trail of quiet payments, the commission for that forgery to her own man of business, a discovery that never reached a courtroom, because Cassandra had married, with unseemly haste, a widowed baronet in Shropshire the same season the truth surfaced, and had not returned to the county since, her influence over its drawing rooms diminishing at exactly the rate her absence allowed other, kinder voices room to be heard. Baron Voss had died the previous autumn, quietly in his own bed at Voss Manor, having spent his last 2 years, to Eleanor's lasting and cautious surprise, entirely free of requests for advances against her allowance, a change he had never explained and she had never pressed him to, choosing instead to let the improvement stand unexamined, the way one lets a fragile piece stand rather than testing whether it will hold. It was Julian who addressed the crowd that morning, standing on the schoolroom's shallow front step, with the Dowager Duchess Augusta seated in the front rank of chairs arranged upon the lawn, her cane planted before her like a scepter, and Prudence beside her, and behind them tenants and servants and half the county's lesser gentry, all gathered to see a dairy house made into something that would outlast every one of them. He did not speak long, because he had never been a man who trusted length to do the work precision could do faster, but what he said Eleanor would remember for the whole of her life afterward, word for word, the way one remembers the exact shape of a debt finally and completely repaid. There was a night in this house, some years past, he said, and his voice carried easily across the lawn in the particular stillness that gathers, when a crowd senses something true is about to be said. When I stood in my own dining hall and read my wife's worth aloud from a ledger, as though a woman's value could be tallied against the cost of her keep, and I did it without understanding, until the room had already gone silent around me, exactly what I had permitted to be said in my hearing. They said she cost this house more than she returned to it. They were wrong. They said a baron's daughter with a modest dowry could bring nothing to Ashcombe worth having. They were wrong. They said, in their quieter moments, that a woman without rank or fortune of her own could be managed, minimized, kept small enough to require no real accounting. They were wrong about that, most of all, because she did not need keeping. She is the one who has kept us, every one of us gathered on this lawn, through harvests and scandals, and every ordinary difficult season a house endures, and I have spent 3 years learning, slowly and at considerable cost to my own pride, that the woman I once permitted to be tallied in a column is the very reason this estate still has anything worth tallying at all. She is patient in a house that gave her little reason to be. She is generous with people who offered her nothing in return. She is, and has always been, exactly the kind of quiet, uncelebrated strength that a great house survives on, and rarely thinks to thank, and I mean to spend whatever years remain to me, making certain that omission is corrected daily rather than once, on a lawn, in a speech. The applause that followed was not the qualified, partial laughter Cassandra's wit had once earned in that same house. It rose instead from every corner of the gathered crowd at once, tenants and gentry together, genuine in a way no performance at Ashcombe had ever quite managed to be, and Eleanor, standing at the edge of the crowd, with her plain elm workbox tucked, absurdly and deliberately, beneath one arm, because she had decided that morning that the humble thing deserved its place in the record of the day as much as anything grander, felt the sound of it move through her like warmth, finally reaching a room that had been cold for a very long time. Augusta, beside her, said only, in the dry, tart voice that had believed in Eleanor before Eleanor had finished a single sentence 3 years before, that it had taken the fool long enough, and that she supposed better late honesty than none, and reached over to pat Eleanor's hand with a satisfaction that needed no further words to explain itself. Let them talk, Eleanor thought, watching the crowd around the schoolroom door, of the season when the house had watched her fall, because so many more of them now stood here to witness her recovery, and a fall witnessed by everyone means considerably less, in the end, than a rising witnessed by the very people who mattered. She was always worth believing in, Eleanor thought, not as a vanity, but as a fact she had finally, after 3 years and a ledger and a forged letter and a storm, been permitted to know plainly rather than merely hope. The rain that had lashed Ashcombe's windows the night of Julian's confession had cleared by dawn the following morning into a sky scrubbed so clean it seemed almost new. And it was that same clean, washed light, 3 years distant now, but somehow still present in every dawn since, that fell across the lawn the morning of the schoolroom's opening, storm long spent, the world rinsed and steady and beginning again exactly as it always did, indifferent and generous by turns. Julian came down from the step once the crowd had begun to disperse toward the tables laid out with cider and bread for the day's small feast, and found her standing apart, near the edge of the kitchen garden she had built from her mother's saved seed, and he did not say anything grand, because they had long since stopped needing grand things said between them in public. He only took her hand, the one that wore the plain gold band he had placed there himself in a firelit library, and did not let it go, and together they turned to watch the children spill out through the schoolroom's new glazed windows into the bright washed morning, laughing at something none of the adults could hear. And Eleanor thought, with the particular quiet certainty of a woman who has finally been allowed to stop bracing herself, that none of it had been perfect, that none of it had come easily, that a debt-bound marriage and a cruel ledger and a forged letter and years of quiet endurance were not the beginning any story would choose if it were permitted to choose freely, but that what stood on the lawn now, hand in hand in the clean light after so long a storm, was simply shared, fully and at last, between two people who had finally chosen it, and that this, imperfect and hard-won as it was more than enough.